Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to yet another session of the NPTEL course, The History of English Language and Literature. We've begun our discussion on the Restoration period, and in today's session we shall be looking at perhaps the first segment of the period characterized by the Age of Dryden. So we shall take a look at the major prose writers of this period at the outset. So let's take a look at the major features of the prose writers of the Restoration period, also known as the Age of Dryden in the beginning. And it is generally considered that these writers of the Restoration period, or the age known as the Age of Dryden, they are generally considered as the real creators of modern English prose. There is very little disagreement among the literary historians and critics about this opinion. And we also find that there is a huge production of versified pamphlets during this period. In fact, though there are a lot of prose discussions in this literary scene of England during this period, we find verse also being used as a vehicle of argument, controversy, and also personal and political satire. And also we begin to see that we do not find literature of the kind of Spenser or Milton during this period. It is more of a rational and more prosaic form of even poetic diction that comes into play during this period. There is a lot of emphasis on scientific thinking, as we began to notice even in the previous session, and there is also a lot of attempts being made at popular science writing. Science also becomes a popular kind of form during that time, and people are more interested in knowing about the recent discoveries and also giving a certain scientific bent to their thinking patterns, and also knowing about the basis and the fundamentals of many day-to-day things. We also notice that the Royal Society was formed under the patronage of Charles II, and the same committee had, or the same set of people had also appointed a committee for the improvement of English language. We find this going side by side with the innovations being made in the scientific field. English language also attains a certain kind of status alongside. And in 1664, this committee is getting appointed with members such as Dryden, John Evelyn, Edmund Waller, Bishop Thomas Sprat, etc. English language also enters a particular different strand of thought altogether, and we also begin to notice that language is no longer the vehicle of merely artistic and literary articulations, but also of scientific and rational thought. Given the political turn of affairs which led to the Civil War and also the execution of King Charles I, we find that the Restoration period is dominated by a lot of debates about the king's power, about the rights of the people, and also about the nature of the society. It is during this period we find discussions on English public sphere and civil society emerging to the foreground. There are a lot of political as well as philosophical debates about the contribution of each of these spheres to the general well-being of mankind in general. We also notice that the literary imagination becomes more contained and more closed in nature. So there is a lot of focus on scandals, domestic troubles, and human relationships of those times, which we also noticed in the previous session. This also had led to a certain kind of topicalness in the articulations, which also led to a distancing from the posterity in terms of topics, in terms of personal affairs, etc. This period was particularly dominated by non-fiction prose writings. So, what were the various kinds of prose writings which were available during this period? We notice that essays and diaries dominate the scene during this period. There are a lot of discussions about the topical and familiar subjects in these essays, and we also find the diaries talking about the contemporary period and also giving a historical insight on the various ways of life and the political turn of events of those periods. There is also a set of newer kinds of genres in the form of epistles and also texts which are written in the form of dialogues, which also incorporated a lot of debates of the political and social religious nature. There were also pamphlets and periodicals which dominated this period, and we also find a lot of writings of a personal nature. such as advice essays, biographies, and this is the period when people also begin to form an interest in the way in which human mind functions, and so these personal writings do gain a lot of popularity during this period, and we find that this trend continues even into the later centuries. And there is a contribution of serious kind of writing such as literary criticism. This is perhaps the era which began to notice that criticism needs to be taken as a very serious affair, and also that this kind of informed criticism contributed much to the development of literature and also to the evolution of different kinds of art forms. We find history writing also reaching a different paradigm altogether. Two kinds of histories get written during this period, religious and political history, and however we also notice that literary histories begin to be written only at a later point of time, and in the 17th century we do not find any active contribution being made to the field of literary history as such. In newspapers and the pamphlets which were doing its rounds during those time, we find scientific material also being displayed as a news item, because there was a general interest in people in knowing more about what had been happening in various fields of especially in the newly emergent kind of disciplines in scientific rational thought. In terms of language and style, we find this period becoming more plain and direct in comparison with the earlier periods where a certain kind of rhetoric dominated the articulations, and we also notice that information begins to be delivered in an unadorned style, and this also is the beginning, as we noted at the outset of this lecture, that this also notes the beginning of a particular kind of prose way in which language begins to articulate its function. If we begin to look specifically at the age of Dryden, this period lasted from 1660 to 1700, and this age gets named after the poet and the dramatist John Dryden, because he was the most singular important figure, literary figure and the cultural figure of those times, given the way in which the art and literature had begun to decline from the earlier standards set by the Elizabethan and the Jacobean period. Hudson talks about John Dryden as the greatest man of a little age, and he is in many ways considered as the one complete representative and exponent of the Restoration period itself, the period which lasted till the early 1700s. Dryden had two poets as his forerunners, mainly Edmund Waller and Sir John Denham, and they were also considered as the pioneers of the classic school of poetry. In that sense, we find in Dryden also an articulation of the classic taste in art and poetry. And this was also a sort of a reaction against the excesses and the obscurity of the metaphysical poetry which had dominated the previous decade, as we had noted earlier. Dryden's earlier poems, those were published even before 1660, and the earliest poem was one that commemorated the death of Oliver Cromwell. We also notice that he shifted his loyalties soon after the restoration of Charles II, and we find him writing a poem about the happy restoration of Charles II in 1660 itself, with the imminent return of Charles II from exile to England. Dryden's poetic craft was greatly influenced by Abraham Cowley, who was a leader of the metaphysical poets, and in one of his poems Dryden also talks about Cowley as the darling of his youth. And this influence is quite significant in the sense that though Dryden's poetry was quite removed from that of the metaphysical poetry, we find him using a lot of conceits and a lot of exaggerated metaphors in many of his poetic works. So in that sense, in his poetic abilities, we find a continuation getting built into the poetic sensibilities of the period. In 1663, we notice that Dryden also begins to write plays, and the theatre had made a comeback to England with the restoration of Charles II, and we also find that theatre and playwriting was perhaps the most profitable form of art during that period. So any writer or an artist who wanted to make a living out of his literary genius had to resort to writing plays. So we do find Dryden writing plays for quite some time during his poetic career, and in 1667 he composed this major poem of his known as Annus Mirabilis. This spoke about the wonderful year which witnessed two major events. One, the war with Holland, and secondly the Great Fire of London. The Fire of London by itself was a tragic event, but the restructuring of the city and the restoration of the city that followed soon after spoke a lot about the new spirit and the new pace with which England was going. So, this poem was a celebration of the newer ways in which London and England was asserting itself in this new age of restoration. By 1670, we find that Dryden reaches the peak of his career. He is appointed as the poet laureate in Charles II's court. He continues to enjoy a lot of royal patronage and recognition until the time that he converts himself into Catholicism and loses all of this favor instantly. Two of his doctrinal poems they deserve particular mention. These two poems are known as Religio Laici and The Hind and the Panther. Both were presented in the form of an argument in verse. These were not strictly religious, so to speak, but they dealt with theological and also controversial kind of material. So, we do not find religion coming into it in the way that it did in the metaphysical poetry. We do not find religion coming into this in the form of metaphysical poetry, but in the form of a more rational and controversial kind of discussion. He was also quite famous for the fables that he composed, and he was considered in that sense one of the best storytellers in verse. And one of the most significant fable that he wrote was named Palamon and Archite, and this was considered as a sort of an imitation of Chaucer's A Knight's Tale. And many critics later on they felt that this was quite an instructive opportunity for making a comparison between a 14th century poet and a 17th century poet, and both of them incidentally contributed a lot to the age that both the ages were named after the poets, such as the age of Chaucer and in 17th century the age of Dryden. At a later point towards the end of his career, we find him converting to Roman Catholicism from his Protestant faith. And we do find him facing the consequences of this with the revolution of 1688, and with this we find that he loses his poet laureate position and he no longer enjoys any kind of official recognition, and his later years were also devoted to writing. In that sense, we find a lot of similarity that he shares with the poet Milton, who also leads an obscure life towards the end of his life, but ends up producing some of the masterpieces that he composed. Dryden is perhaps best known for the political satires that he produced, and we also notice that his literary genius was at its best in these satires that he composed. The best known work was Absalom and Achitophel, which was published in 1681. It is considered as a political satire in verse. This was based on a lot of contemporary events that happened, a lot of things about power and succession, and it was written in the form of an allegory. This was based on the biblical story of the rebellion of Absalom against his father David, and this in the biblical story we also find that the rebellion was instigated by Absalom's advisor Achitophel. So, in this poem the role of Absalom is given to James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth. At this point we also need to recall that Charles II did not lead a very honorable life in terms of his moral tendencies. We find him having a lot of affairs with the mistresses that he had. This was quite a condemnable thing during that period, and we also notice that he had a lot of illegitimate children who were living in England and also in certain parts of Europe. So, in that sense, Duke of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was one of the illegitimate children of Charles II, and he also enjoyed a lot of popularity in England during that period because he had done a lot of things for the Protestant cause. So, England being dominated by people of the Protestant faith, the popularity was much in favor of the Duke of Monmouth. And it is also important to remember that Charles II had no heir, and there was no one apparently who was ready for succession. So, and his brother James II, who could have perhaps become the next king, he was openly a Catholic, so he did not enjoy any kind of popularity either. At this point of time, we also find the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was also a close ally and an advisor of Duke of Monmouth. He brings up this exclusion bill in the parliament and ensures that James II will not be able to inherit the throne of England after the death of Charles II. However, history had a different turn of events which we shall come back to at a later point of time. And by 1681, Soon after the Exclusion Bill, we find the Earl of Shaftesbury also engineering another thing by trying to appeal for the legitimacy of the Duke of Monmouth. However, things do not go very well for Shaftesbury and Monmouth. We find that Monmouth gets caught preparing to rebel against reigning King Charles II, who is also his father. And Shaftesbury is also suspected at this point of time. We find him getting arrested and charged with high treason. So, in the poem we find Earl of Shaftesbury being given the role of Achitophel, and King David in the Bible is obviously Charles II of England. So, many who have studied this poem and many literary critics at a later point, they also notice that there is a kind of way in which we find a lot of traces of Milton in this poem. We find Achitophel being modelled along with Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost, and this poem was a huge hit when it was published in the Restoration period. We find that this poem was published just a week before the Earl of Shaftesbury was tried on high treason, and this was a cause of tremendous popular excitement. However, he was later acquitted, but the poem continues to be celebrated as one of the best works by Dryden and also one of the most popular satires of the period. Dryden continued to write more satires. The Medal was a further invective against the Earl of Shaftesbury, and there was another significant poem that he wrote, again a verse satire, which was named Macflecknoe. This was a poem in which he ridiculed this particular poet and one of his contemporary known as Thomas Shadwell. And Macflecknoe meant the son or the successor of Flecknoe. And Richard Flecknoe was a poet who was notorious as a bad poet during those times, and we find that this particular poet Richard Flecknoe, he had enjoyed a lot of bad reputation during those times. So, Dryden sort of plays on this very topical thing, and he uses this as a ploy to attack Thomas Shadwell, who is a rival of him, and also because he had responded to the Medal in which Dryden had attacked the Earl of Shaftesbury. So, the poem is also considered as quite humorous with a lot of scathing wit built into it. And in that he presents Shadwell as the successor of the kingdom of nonsense and dullness in prose and verse. And he is also treated with a lot of humorous contempt, which arguably the people during the time quite enjoyed as well. And one example would be, in the poem he talks about Shadwell as one who stands confirmed in full stupidity, but Shadwell never deviates into sense. Significantly, Shadwell was a poet who was already satirized by Andrew Marvell, and Dryden continues to play with the same kind of theme, and it becomes hugely popular as well. If we try to look at the features of Dryden's poetry, it's quite varied, and he is considered as the representative of the age. But there is also a general want of poetic qualities in him, because it was mostly intellectual, and we also find a manly vigor of style in his writings. He was also quite capable of producing satire and reason in verse, which is still considered as one of the most important qualities of his writings. And according to Johnson, he was also the founder of new versification. However, in spite of that, we do find that his poetry is generally seen as lacking in time when we compare it with the poetry of the earlier period. Nevertheless, he continues to stand tall as the most singular figure during the Restoration period. The other major poets of this period include John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester. It's said that he was better known for his bohemian lifestyle that include drinking, a lot of love affairs, and also dramatic deathbed conversation, which was quite popular during those times. And in his poetic style, we find a combination of three generations: the influence of the metaphysical poetry, the Cavalier poetry, and also the Augustan poetry of the Restoration period. His best known poetical work is the Maimed Debauchee. It was also a self-directed satire, and many feel that in this work he had also anticipated the work of Alexander Pope, which we shall be taking a look at when we engage with the age of Pope. Talking about John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester, he was a very popular and quite a notorious figure as well in during the Restoration period. He also was one of the important figures in Restoration drama. We shall be taking a closer look at him again when we talk about Restoration drama, and in particular the Restoration comedy. The other important writer was Matthew Prior. He was mostly a writer of light and casual verse, and we also find that he had parodied a work of Dryden, The Hind and the Panther, and he had it was titled The Story of the Country Mouse and the City Mouse. It was a burlesque which was a parody of Dryden's work. Having taken a look at the major poetic productions of the period, we move on to look at the major prose writings of this time. So, we begin looking at the major writings by John Dryden himself. He had mostly written essays and prefaces which spoke about the issues related to drama and poetry. And we also find that his work had considerably contributed to the growth of literary criticism in general. And he is also considered as the first modern critic after Philip Sidney. His major work, the Essay of Dramatic Poesy, in this work he talks about the classical drama of the Greeks and the Romans, and also the neoclassical drama of the French and the romantic drama of English, and he also attempts a sort of comparison and tries to justify the use of rhyme in the place of blank verse. And he was the one he was the master of versification during that time, and we do find him not imitating the earlier stalwarts, but developing his own style and also his own theoretical framework for composing particular kinds of poetry as well as drama. And this work, the Essay of Dramatic Poesy, it was written with particular objectives in mind, one of them being to vindicate the honor of our English writers from the censure of those who unjustly prefer the French before them. If you remember, in one of the earlier sessions when we began discussing the Restoration period, we noticed that in the European scene there was a domination of the French taste over all the other kinds of cultures and other kinds of literatures. So, in England also we find repercussions of it, and we find most of them preferring a French model as a literary writer, or even trying to build in a certain Frenchness to their compositions. So, Dryden had tried to go against the grain of this dominant French influence during those times, and we also find him admiring the ancients and placing them as proper models. But at the same time, he also pleads for modernization and advancement in literature, and he also rejected the Roman comedies along with the French drama. His work, however important it is even in the contemporary, it was considered as a hasty and carelessly written work. It continues to be historically important, but it has slight permanent value. But however, the work is dominated by a sound good sense, which also makes it very important in the field of literary criticism even in the contemporary. The other significant prose writer of this period was Samuel Butler. He is best known for his work Hudibras, which was a satire on the Puritans. This work Hudibras was written in 3 parts. One was the first one published in 1663, second one in 1664, and the third one in 1678. This work was considered as an instant hit as soon as it was published. It was hugely popular. It was also modeled on the famous work Don Quixote. The work was considered witty and vivacious, and people also took instantly to it. But in looking back at it from the modern times, it is also too long, and there is an inability to sustain the reader's interest. The subject matter was also very topical, it was contemporary. The subject matter was also quite local and temporary, it was mostly of topical interest. So, in that sense, it also becomes a disadvantage for today's reader. The intention in Hudibras through a satire was to kill Puritanism by ridicule, but however we find that most of the representations, they only become mere caricatures. These depictions in Hudibras also exaggerated and caricatured the extravaganza and charlatanism of the Puritans, and many critics also feel that the work Hudibras had neglected Puritanism and failed to give it any kind of recognition for the historical role that it played in changing the history of Britain, perhaps forever. Nevertheless, this work delighted Charles II's court greatly, and this was considered as the one of the favorite readings of Charles II. It said that Charles II laughed over and praised it. But however, Butler was forced to spend his final years in poverty. He had also grown out of the court's favor. We do not find him contributing much after this, after his fallout with the court. The most important prose writer perhaps of this period is John Bunyan, who lived from 1628 to 1688. His best known work, which is read and taught even in the contemporary, is The Pilgrim's Progress. Bunyan in fact had a very significant role to play during that period, and he was quite different from the other artists and the other writers of those times. He was born as the son of a tinker, also entered into that profession shortly. He participated in the Civil War. The sides which he took remains quite ambiguous. He also is said to have married early. By 1655, there is enough evidence to show that he had begun to preach, the activity that he continued even after the Restoration. The kind of faith life that he lived and the kind of impact that it had on the England, particularly in London, it was not based on the political loyalties of those times. Bunyan had made a very personal choice which had gone much beyond the politics of those times. And during this time, we also find him getting convicted as a common upholder of several unlawful meetings. He was forced to spend about 12 years in Bedford jail in England during that time. But we do find him getting quite productive during this time. His first and autobiographical work, Grace Abounding, was produced during this period of captivity. And at a later point, again, he was imprisoned for about 6 months. We find him writing Pilgrim's Progress. He begins writing Pilgrim's Progress during the second period of captivity. Later, we find him obtaining a license to preach, and he becomes a regular minister of the Baptist congregation. He also continued to hold meetings in a barn at Bedford, and at later years we also find him emerging as one of the popular and famous preachers in London. In terms of his works, he wrote much, but talking about Bunyan's work, he wrote much, but he is best known for 4 of his works: The Pilgrim's Progress, Grace Abounding, The Life and Death of Mr. Batman, and The Holy War. Pilgrim's Progress is perhaps the most famous of all his works, and it also played an important role in the evolution of prose fiction in England. And this was didactic and allegorical, but nevertheless it continues to be considered as a forerunner of the novel, a form which emerges a century later. Historians feel that his wonderful imagination gave him a place almost by himself in an unimaginative age. This was quite a feat, the kind of productions that Bunyan had, it was quite a feat to achieve during that particular age, which was fed mostly by Puritanism and later by the extravagance of the Restoration period. And he also was not educated, unlike most of the writers of the times, and he knew nothing about the classics. He was not well versed in the theories of literature or the techniques of artistic production. But it said that he knew the authorized version of the English Bible by heart, and that was the only kind of raw material from which he drew most of his imagination. And we also find that he was one person who was endowed by nature with a genius for style. Unlike the other writers, he did not have any kind of training in a formal literary production. So if one asks who was the greatest product of Puritanism, there is a debate there's an ongoing debate whether it's Milton or whether it's Bunyan. But there are many historians and critics who do feel that undoubtedly the greatest product of Puritanism is Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. So there's a way in which a comparative study is done between Milton and Bunyan. Though Milton was also influenced by Puritanism, he was also fed by the spirit of Renaissance. But in Bunyan, we do find that he was entirely a child of Puritanism, and in that sense, his work is also, his genius is also considered most supreme, because it continues to remain untainted with the bad effects of Puritanism, but it also had inherited all the positive and great things from this movement of Puritanism. The other important figure was Sir William Temple, who was also a diplomat and statesman. We find him composing a lot of reflective and socio-political essays. One of his works, Of Health and Long Life, it displayed skepticism towards science and religion. If we noticed also in the beginning that there is a way in which science, religion and literature had begun to come together, particularly in the prose writings of the period. The other 2 significant works were Memoirs of What Passed in Christendom from 1672 to 1679 and Of Ancient and Modern Learning, where he compared the ancient forms of learning with the modern forms of learning available in the Restoration period. According to Dr. Johnson, he was the one who gave cadence to English prose. In that sense, his style, more than the content, his style is considered more important contribution to English prose writings. The other interesting information is that Jonathan Swift, who emerges as an important writer at a later period, he was also Temple's secretary for a brief period of time. John Locke was another important prose writer. He was also a philosopher along with Thomas Hobbes. He was very active in the politics of the 1670s and the 80s. He is also considered as the centerpiece of English philosophical thought. His major work is the essay concerning human understanding, published in 1690. It's in this work that he introduced this idea of the mind as a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, which was free to receive any kind of new impulses and new influences. And he also had composed 2 treatises on government and the particular kinds of governance. This was in 1690. He also very actively and vehemently opposed the divine right of monarchy, which was perhaps the root cause of most of the problems and the tussles between the monarchy and the parliament, monarchy and the commoners during those times. He also believed that men are born with a certain set of natural rights, and then they enter into a social contract with particular kinds of government. This is also for survival, that they make compromises and they also willingly give up certain rights in order to ensure a peaceful kind of living. But at the same time, he maintained that if the state or the monarch at any point of time, if they encroached upon this upon these natural rights that the human being possessed, a popular rebellion against the king or any kind of authority could be justified. And this political thesis was considered very controversial during that time, but influenced the popular imagination in such a way that it continued to lay the foundations of many civil and political thoughts in England, and also later on in Europe in general. The other important prose writing figures included Thomas Burnet and John Tillotson. Thomas Burnet's writings were considered heavily pedantic, and he also had a bent towards natural philosophy. The 2 major groups of people who dominated the scene in London during those times were the Quakers and the Deists. The Quakers, they opposed any kind of institutional form of religion, and the important writers in this group were George Fox, William Penn and Robert Barclay. Their individual pieces, however, are not worthy to be mentioned over here. And there was also a particular group known as the Deists, who believed that the proof for existence of God exists in all kinds of natural things that we see around. So, the major proponents and the major writers of the group of Deists included the Lord Shaftesbury, the 3rd Earl, the Earl who was convicted of rebelling against the king was the 1st Earl of Shaftesbury. This Lord Shaftesbury, the philosopher, is the 3rd Earl. Then John Ray, George Temple, the Marquess of Halifax. The works of the Quakers and the works of the Deists were very popular and influential during those times. This was also the period which saw the flourishing of journals and periodicals, and as we noted in the earlier session, this was a result of the lapse of the Licensing Act in 1695. We find many newspapers and pamphlets emerging as political tools during this period. The Flying Post was a journal which in certain ways supported the Whig party, and the Post Boy supported the Tory party. And we also find another significant work by Sir Roger L'Estrange. He ran a series which could be called as a journal or a pamphlet known as the Observator. This ran from 1681 till 87. This dealt with very complex political issues that troubled England during those times, and this was in the form of, in a very interesting form, the dialogue between the observator, who was a writer himself, and a party ideologue or a functionary. So, this also gave an interesting format for the people to engage with particular kinds of debates and dialogues during this period. The other significant series that ran from 1698 till 1700 was Ned Ward's London Spy. This was a work of a different nature altogether. It gave an insight into England's tourist spots, low life in prisons. It used contemporary slang. It used songs of the period. It used a lot of vulgar dialogues. It also catered to the low life in many ways. And Pramod Nair, a compiler of literary history, he considers this as a forerunner of modern day yellow journalism and tabloid. A significant work of Ned Ward was the trip to New England in 1699, where he spoke about the reasons that drove the English people to live in the colonies of their island. So, he had this very controversial thing to say about this migration from the mainland to the colonies. Bishops, bailiffs and bastards were the three terrible persecutions which chiefly drove our brethren to seek their fortunes in our foreign colonies. Around this time, we also find that many had begun to critique the modes through which colonization was expanding, and also the newfound ways of thought and the ways in which one could critique the government. We find a lot of them finding the policies of the government quite compelling and also quite destructive in many ways. So, we find this critique growing to such an extent that it ceases to become a major problem, or it ceases to become a threat altogether. The most important historical document of this period could be the two diaries which were produced by John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys. John Evelyn's diary is a record of contemporary events, and it was written from the point of view of a loyal, high-minded royalist. It recorded the contemporary events, and it's a matter of it's a lot of interest for the historians and as well as for the literary critics of the later period. And Samuel Pepys' diary was considered as most significant. His work is also of historical value, but at the same time it was entertaining, and it is also considered as a piece of extraordinary literature. Pepys' diary covered a period of 10 years from 1st Jan 1660 till 31st May 1669. This also covered major events of the period, including the Restoration, the Plague and the Great Fire. It also spoke about a lot of things in England which particularly characterized that age, and also the Englishness of the period, such as the streets of London, the coffee house, the playhouse of the times, etc. And it's also significant that he did not write for the public eye. So, it had a lot of personal material built into it, which also heightened its literary value and also the sentiments which were built into it. And he also had interestingly used a shorthand to write this diary, which was not deciphered until the early 19th century. Afra Ben was perhaps the only woman writer of this period who deserves particular mention, and we also find her getting talked about in various ways in the later histories, particularly from the 19th and the early 20th century onwards. She had composed plays, written short stories and longer fiction as well. She was also the first professional women writer of the times. She was more famous for breaking the cultural barriers of those times, and also she is considered as a literary model for later generations of women. She interestingly also worked as Charles II's spy. So, she was quite unconventional and quite influential during those times in many ways. And her most important fiction work was Orunoko, or the Royal Slave, A True History, published in 1688. This was a love story that reversed the colonial and European stereotypes of those times. And we also find in that a mix of travel writing, romance and historical fiction coming together. We also find in Ben's writing a sort of critique against the dominant tendencies of colonization during that time. And we also find these particular and significant references to the colonial white colonial masters as notorious villains. There is this particular passage where she talks about the white colonial masters as a group of people who understood neither the laws of God or man and had no sort of principles to make them worthy the name of men. We shall come back to discussing Afra Ben at a later point when we again talk about the Restoration drama, because she was also a professional writer and who could kind of secure a lot of success and a lot of professional attention through her plays as well. Her stature was of supreme importance that she deserved a mention at a later point in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Virginia Woolf writes about her with this particular mention: all women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Afra Ben, which is most scandalously but rather appropriately in Westminster Abbey, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds. So, we wind up this lecture with this positive note for today, and in the next session we shall come back to take a look at the Restoration drama and in particular Restoration comedy of those times. That's all we have for today's lecture. Thank you for listening. Look forward to seeing you in the next session.